Hey guys, it's the Melblade 5, and I am so relieved that I can finally tie up this loose thread that has been hanging over me for the past year. I've covered 5 parts of the Joestar's bizarre adventures, and now it's on to the 6th. Stone Ocean. Now is also when we get to the parts that I didn't even know existed prior to me getting into the series. After I got caught up with the anime and later reached the next phase of waiting for the next part to be adapted, I was fully on board the train of anticipation over that time because I couldn't wait to see what would succeed this. And since I lack a reliable way of reading the manga, I became aware of some details of Part 6's story here and there over the years through word of mouth and what I had seen of the original All-Star battle in Eyes of Heaven. But as usual, I didn't know how these details ultimately played out, so I was still very much in the dark about it all. However, I had also heard word that this was apparently considered the worst part, which wasn't exactly the best first impression to get. But then over time, I came across a lot more people defending or speaking positively in general about this part, which certainly helped to relieve any doubts I may have had from those prior opinions. So by the time the adaptation was officially confirmed, I was so excited. And not long after I started watching, I got so invested in it. Then everything fell silent, by no fault of the anime itself. To address the elephant in the room, Netflix bought the streaming rights to JoJo, so Stone Ocean was released on Netflix in batches. I've never been a fan of this release format because you lose the continuously building hype across episodes that you get with weekly releases, but since we got the first 12 episodes in the first batch, which would roughly last 3 months if released weekly, I figured it would take about 3 or 4 months for the next batch to come out, which I could live with, but that didn't happen. We had to wait 9 months for the second batch. This wait was a nightmare to say the least. There were times when I genuinely forgot the anime had even started from how much we were left in the dark over those 9 months. To the point that it finally motivated me to look into more of the spin-offs, partly as a means to fill the void, and left my hype levels feeling so sporadic, like yeah! And I wanted to wait until this part was finished before making a video on it so I could present my fully comprehended opinions and best judge what bits I should dedicate more time to discussing. Fortunately, we only had to wait another 3 months for the third and final batch, but the damage had already been done for how frustrating it was to follow its release, adding this onto the ever-growing list of Netflix's fuck-ups. But now that it is finished after a whole year, there is nothing holding me back from making this video now. Here is my experience with JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Stone Ocean. In 2011 Florida, at the scene of a hit and run and later in a cell, we are introduced to our next JoJo, Jolene Cujo. And as you can probably guess from her surname, she's Jotaro's daughter, even though they're spelt differently for some reason. Did Rocky forget how to spell it? From what little I had seen of Jolene from the video games at this point, I got the impression that her personality was just a more vulgar version of Jotaro's. But getting to see her properly here made me realize that was far from the truth. She did inherit a lot of Jotaro's traits, but in execution, it's much more of a likeness to him rather than a full-on copy, with her unique qualities being best displayed by what really surprised me about Jolene's character after I began to notice this, which is how different her story arc and its themes feel compared to the previous protagonists. Jolene is very much a fish out of water in all this. She grew up a delinquent, in part due to Jotaro being absent throughout most of her life, which unbeknownst to her was because he was away protecting her from enemy stand users. This made her grow to resent him, and in turn disown her family lineage, making her thematically opposed to her position as a Joestar. Then she ends up even more out of water in the story, as the hit and run was all part of an elaborate setup to frame Jolene for murder, in which she is sentenced to 15 years in Green Dolphin Street Prison, thrusting her into an incredibly bleak and serious situation through no fault of her own that forces her to toughen up more to survive. And as a result of toughening up and from how the story pans out, she reverses her past attitude towards her family and fully adopts her role in her bloodline. In spite of how she's thrown into the struggle against evil, the way Jolene's character develops makes the moments where she displays the Joestar family traits all the more satisfying, as it subtly signifies just how much she's matured as a person by then. In addition to showing how much stronger she's become both physically and mentally compared to how helpless she was at the beginning. Like with her unusual coping mechanism for getting arrested. And on a similar note, I was surprised by just how goofy Jolene is at times, which is mainly seen when she is especially out of her comfort zone. Though not a big aspect of her character, I appreciate how this shows more sides to her behind that normally tough exterior, which combined with everything else about her, proved that she is not the always aggressive edgelord that I initially thought she'd be. Something that I wish Netflix and Viz understood too. But Jolene wouldn't have been able to grow as much as she does if not for pricking her finger on the shard of a stand arrow that JoJo sent to her through a pendant, thus awakening her own stand. Stone Free. A stand that was also very different to what I thought it'd be. Ironically, Stone Free is made entirely out of string, where Jolene can control each of its individual strands for all sorts of long-range skills like grabbing out-of-reach objects and binding opponents, but can also bring all of its strands together to create its humanoid form, which sacrifices that range in return for greater power similar to Star Platinum's. Despite being a pretty simple concept for an ability, Araki comes up with a lot of really creative ways of using the string to showcase a wide variety of tactics, thus giving Stone Free many techniques to utilize and keeping Jolene's fights interesting by seeing how she strategizes her way out. A few episodes in, Jolene is visited by JoJo and I'm sorry. What is it with JoJo's outfits getting more ridiculous as time goes on? And he's supposed to be 40 now, even though he still looks exactly the same as he did in part 3. Anyway, the reason JoJo is here is to enact a prison break. But before we can break Jolene out, they are both targeted in one huge mindfuck of a stand attack that ends with JoJo being struck by a stand called White Snake, whose primary power is to steal other people's stands and memories by converting them into discs, leaving JoJo in a comatose state. So after learning the truth that her dad really does love her, and acting as the big focal point of her arc, Jolene makes it her mission to hunt down Whitesnake and recover JoJo's discs in order to bring him back. But she'll need some help to achieve that, which first comes in the form of Emporio, a kid who was born and spent his whole life inside the prison, whose mum was killed by Whitesnake years prior. Don't know how he got the baseball outfit though. Emporio was a weird case for me when it came to my thoughts on him. I never disliked him at all, and I do like how he's the main person who brings out Jolene's gentle, caring side, as well as feeling for how lonely he must have been for so long after his mother's death. But obviously due to story reasons, he does play a very backseat role out of all the main characters, since he needs to stay hidden in his ghost room, which is the form of his stand called Burning Down the House that acts as a safe room similar to Mr. President. This means he's not really active throughout a lot of the parts, acting as the intel of sorts, but only when someone goes into burning down the house in the first place. So I didn't develop a strong affinity towards Emporio until way later. Or maybe I'm stupid and I just missed something. That's equally likely. Either way, he's still just a kid. We need another fighter on our side to aid with combat. And that's who we quickly get. Enter Hermes Costello. She was also someone who took a bit of time for me to figure out my feelings on, but only for the early portions of this part. Cause we go from her teasing Jolene in the first scene in the holding cell, to them appearing to develop a rapport when they're on the bus ride to prison, to later finding out that she stole JoJo's pendant to then sell to Gwes. It made her come off as very two-faced, which I found weird considering I knew beforehand that she's the Joe bro of this part. Or I guess, Joe sis in this case. Then after she's forced to fight against Highway to Hell and learning that Jolene is connected to all this, the two quickly become good friends. In fact, her personality is actually closer to what I thought Jolene's was, though still very much off from that. Even she has a few goofy moments here and there for the same benefit. But the biggest factor that helped me to understand Hermes and her personality was at the beginning of the second batch when we finally learn her background. Her older sister, Gloria, was murdered by a gangster named Sportsmax, but he used his criminal connections to get a very light sentence for murder. So she intentionally got herself thrown in prison in order to get to Sportsmax and kill him for revenge. Now all her aggression made perfect sense to me from knowing her motives, and when Jolene helps her through her situation when that time came, her gratefulness towards her in turn helped to strengthen their friendship. And that was after already enjoying the friendly aspect of her from the perspective that Jolene now had someone watching her back in this harsh environment. I just wish I didn't have to wait 9 months to see the backstory so I could get fully behind her. And since she too pricked her finger on the arrow shard, she also got a stand. Kiss. A pretty unorthodox stand, Kiss's ability is the use of stickers that when stuck to something, creates a duplicate of it. Then when the stick is removed, the two snap back into one with some force. Yeah, for this part, when it came to stand powers, it felt like Araki was on more crack than usual. So many of them are just so bizarre, no pun intended, that I wonder how the hell he came up with these ideas. But it continues the trend from the last 2 parts that I liked of the powers being so different from the norm that leads to really unique fights from how these powers are executed. As in Kiss's case, while limited in its use compared to Stone Free, its ability is still used creatively through how Hermes can perform unexpected means of attacking and dodging using the snapping back feature, as well as simple deception with the duplicates. So after Jolene and Hermes manage to track down the whereabouts of Star Platinum's disc, they are halted by an attack from its guard. Foo Fighters. A stand that is used by and made of a colony of plankton, who after being defeated and later spared by Jolene, is inspired to join her as an ally by disguising as the dead prisoner Atro. Foo Fighters is pretty much the comic relief character out of this part's cast, having by far the greatest abundance of and goofiest quirks of them all that stem from her not understanding basic human behavior. In some respects, she's like the purest soul out of all the fighters in the group, despite having tried to kill the others, but that was because of Whitesnake manipulating her to serve them. This is due to her having some of the most innocent motivations out of the group, which at first were more so from a sense of gratitude and reversing her prior position on cooperating with Whitesnake as viewing being with Jolene to be the more advantageous route, which I interpreted as being some form of animalistic survival instinct kicking in. And this leads into a notable part of Foo Fighters' character, in that she surprisingly also has a bit of an arc, though more subtle. She goes from those basic reasons for becoming an ally, and throughout spending more time with the rest of the group, she starts to develop a genuine friendship with them that then becomes her greater purpose for fighting alongside them. This is even demonstrated through her gradually becoming more mature as time goes on, making her come off as more human. This part's cast continued to surprise me, as I never would have expected this sort of character development from a bunch of plankton. Plus, she proves to be a pretty useful member of the team thanks to her stand ability, as she has full control over her plankton makeup that allows her to perform all sorts of manipulation with her body, so long as she stays hydrated, which she mainly does to create literal finger guns, giving me a bunch of Mista flashbacks as she can make some similarly cool trick shots using this technique to fight from a distance. But after increasing the number of good guys, the tone dramatically shifts, as at the end of the episode, we get the sudden reveal of Whitesnake's user and the villain of this part, Enrico Pucci. Oh, Pucci, I have heard a lot about you. Seeing him so soon made me both tense and morbidly excited to witness him in action. This is the moment where I feel the plot fully kicks into motion, as we then learn of Pucci's motives and plans to set a ton more stakes for the heroes. Back in the 80s, he met Dio, and quickly became intoxicated by his ideals, thus making him his closest and most loyal follower. Maybe a bit too close. So apparently, Dio always had an interest in reaching heaven, which in his view is a world where everyone is aware of their fate and forced to accept it, complete with a full plan on how to make this heaven a reality. But as we know, Dio was killed before he could begin said plan. But this goal didn't die with him. Pucci's mission is to finish what Dio started and achieve heaven in his place. Beginning with using Jolene as bait to lure out Jotaro so he could use his memory disk to learn the contents of the plan from Dio's diary, which he destroyed at the end of Stardust Crusaders. Pucci lives up to his role as the villain and then some, even exceeding previous ones in certain aspects. All the past villains had a habit of standing back, letting their underlings do all the work, and only getting directly involved as a last resort. And Pucci does this too, but he is always adapting to the situations made by Jolene and the others' progression, and updates his plans in accordance to remain 2 steps ahead. By using his position as a priest to freely move around Green Dolphin Street and get close to the prisoners to give them stands through the discs he's acquired. A position they make sure you don't forget. Wait, what did he just call him? I mean, he's not wrong. However, Pucci is also willing to fight should the situation call for it, which happens on numerous occasions. This does an amazing job at setting up Pucci as such a cunning and menacing villain. His constant involvement at every turn paints him as this looming threat across everything the heroes do. It's done so well that eventually I began to feel this immense sense of dread whenever Pucci is about to or does become aware of what the others are planning, since I knew they were going to be in deep trouble to say the least. With that multiplier increasing every time. And the last, but most important aspect of Pucci I wanted to cover is how he is the biggest example of Dio's legacy of evil lingering even after his death, as all his beliefs live on through him. And it acts as the perfect parallel to Jolene adopting Jotaro's morals and burdens, making this multi-generational clash continue once more. Not bad, considering every time I hear Pucci's name, all I can think of is this.
When are they gonna get to
Steel Ball Run?
Now that Jolene has the stand disc, she has to sneak around to deliver it to the Speedwagon Foundation while Pucci gets closer on her trail. Luckily, Emporio's given her some backup, which comes in the form of Weather Report, an amnesiac prisoner who had his memories stolen by Pucci and goes by the name of his stand. I consider Weather Report to be the Kakyoin or Rohan of this part, in that he's the very weird and quirky one, but all of his oddities are played very straight and serious most of the time. Things like always walking on his tiptoes and communicating only through whispers, which never seem to come up again past his debut. But he has many other weird behaviors too, and I find this contrast between how he acts and his serious nature, while with him somewhat keeping his feelings to himself due to the amnesia, to be kind of an endearing trait about him since it is a little funny, alongside the serious personality making him come off as cool when he goes no bullshit, straight to the point, kicking the enemy in the ass in his fights. For the few times he does get to fight. Cause unfortunately, Weather Report doesn't get as much screen time as I would have liked, since he is absent for pretty much the entire second batch, which bummed me out cause I really wanted to see more of him in that time frame. And part of that was because of how cool I think the Weather Report stand is, as it has the power to, well, control the weather. So he's basically Storm. Controlling the weather is a power that opens so many possibilities for how it can be applied, which luckily Araki does take advantage of as it's used in a bunch of creative ways here, as well as the implication of how powerful the stand is, with how it can bring over hundreds of poison dart frogs in a hurricane from South America in the span of like 5 minutes. So I also would have loved to have seen more of the stand to see more of what could be done with it, but we just have to miss out on that. After the two end up in a difficult struggle against Wrangler and Pucci, whilst getting badly injured in the process, Jolene ultimately manages to succeed in delivering the disc, even against Whitesnake's secret ability, a gun, which then brings an end to the first batch and the beginning of the 9-month wait. But as we return, like I touched on before, we kick off with Hermes exacting her revenge on Sportsmax. However, he is also working with Pucci, and as such, he was given a stand from him called Limp Bizkit, whose ability is to create invisible zombies. Araki's crack must have been especially strong that day, cause this idea is just so random. It's one thing to summon zombies, but then he's like, nah man, they're also invisible. Like some game of super fight. It does add to the fear factor of the fight since they can't tell where the zombies are, and it turns out Sportsmax did die and got turned into an invisible zombie too, cause his stand somehow didn't disappear upon his death, forcing them into even more danger until Hermes eventually finishes him off once and for all, making him dead-er. But they were too late on dealing with him because
Interactive Pucci comes with his own bone.
Specifically, one of Dio's bones, which had already been reanimated by Limp Bizkit's ability, thus completing the first step of the Heaven Plan. This had me thinking there was gonna be an invisible Dio running around, but instead it's just that the bone moves on its own. And as the guards arrive in the aftermath of the Limp Bizkit fight, Jolene lets herself get thrown into the disciplinary wing as that is where the bone ended up. And it looks like Giorno got a career change. So what better person to help Jolene in this situation than Diavolo's skinny cousin, Narciso Anasui. He was incarcerated for murdering his girlfriend and the fella she was banging. And after having such a brief non-speaking appearance in the first batch, he's finally brought into the fray. Anasui turned out to be a pretty chill but still eccentric character, which is weird considering they made him out to be this always violent and dangerous person from the get-go, when he really isn't. The only times we really see him get violent during these events is towards the antagonists, just like the rest of the main cast. Whilst his eccentricity makes it seem like he's on a different wavelength half the time, which I do find very amusing when shown how it contrasts from the rest of the group in their interactions. Which is most apparent in probably the most notable thing about Anasui, being that he is in love with Jolene, because he finds her passion and determination to be very sexy, which he somehow gleaned from the one previous time they were in the same room. Now I think I know what he was up to when he left. This leads to him attempting many methods to help get Jolene to return his feelings, that often don't go as planned.
愛してるぜ。ここに来るのがとても楽しみだった。
今なんと?
And sometimes they can border on the line of creepiness, meaning I don't know whether to be concerned or laugh at his commitment. Then there's his stand, Diver Down, with its own super distinct ability. Diver Down is able to dive inside people and objects, and from there it can control the target by either manipulating its molecular structure or storing and releasing any force it has been struck with. While much more straightforward in its application compared to the rest of the group stands, I think the idea of this power is really interesting, and it still gets used in some cool ways that go beyond what I initially thought its capabilities could be. I just wish it got used a little more for offensive purposes to see more of what it can do. Sadly, Anasui's introduction became the only high for a little while, cause, to be perfectly honest, I didn't enjoy the disciplinary wing arc all that much. Pucci sent 4 enemy stand users to the wing to take out Jolene, which sets a dire tone, but I found the fights against those stand users to be so underwhelming. I thought the Planet Waves fight was alright, but full of missed potential. As for the build-up, everyone is forced into an uncontrollable rage by Survivor's effect, leading to a riot amongst everyone in there. But the fight itself is limited to just Jolene and Westwood in this one small portion of the wing, whilst all the other inmates just die off screen. I think it would have been way cooler if Jolene had to defend herself from the inmates while simultaneously having to fight Westwood, the most normal-looking stand user in the series. And as for Planet Waves itself, I thought the execution of its ability was so lame. This stand can pull meteors from space, but they end up as flaming pebbles by the time they make it to Earth. It would be so much cooler if they were more like proper meteors, because then the fight could have been so destructive. Even having some of the rioters get killed by meteors as collateral damage, while the building itself gets battered. But instead, we got something more like a drawn-out wrestling match, and I feel so cheated by it. Then we have the Dragon's Dream fight, which was the lowest point of it all, because I found this fight so frustrating to watch. So this stand is essentially a glorified compass that works off of Feng Shui to tell Kenzo where to stand so he has an advantage. Sounds simple to deal with once you know how it works, but it takes 2 whole episodes to beat this thing, with most of the fights following the same repetitive formula because all the characters suddenly lacked common sense. Foo Fighters just takes the brute force approach and keeps trying to shoot at Kenzo no matter how many times he dodges due to the dragon's guidance. Maybe you could try shooting where he's about to go instead? Or any other strategy? Since if it didn't work the first 7 times, it's probably not gonna work again. And the dragon is impartial, so it's also giving advice to her, but she ignores it. Which I can understand the first time since you'd assume it's a trick, but after multiple times, you'd think she'd start listening, but she doesn't. And all this time, Jolene and Anasui are just standing to the side, commentating on everything rather than helping. I know Jolene's injured here, but she could at least send out a single strand of string to try and trip Kenzo over. And Anasui just refuses to get involved unless Foo Fighters dies. He'd rather spend his time regurgitating facts about Feng Shui.
Feng Shui literally can mean wind and water, but what it describes... Help me! Help me!
This stand is only useful in a one-on-one fight. If you all just ganged up on him, he'd be done in no time! It's only until Foo Fighters has seemingly been killed in a series of events akin to a Final Destination film that they finally do something and defeat him. Thank fuck! And then there's the Yo-Yo Ma fight. And I use the term fight loosely here. It's more that they stand around while being slowly corroded by its acidic spit, while Yo-Yo Ma acts like a dumbass and gets even stupider after Anasui inserts a frog brain into him. Then becoming long obsolete by the time he disappears after Foo Fighters kills D&G, who was also a complete wuss. The only thing I really found entertaining about this arc was the story developments. All the dead inmates were used as a sacrifice by being turned into trees, causing Dio's bone to grow into a green baby, which brought back all my incorrect thoughts of this being some kind of resurrection attempt. They try to take the baby as far away from Pucci as possible, but of course this is Pucci, so he soon learns of the baby's birth and manages to catch up to them while mortally wounding Foo Fighters and Anasui in the process, before finally fighting against Jolene face to face. In a pretty intense fist fight between the two that definitely had me more engaged than the past few fights, Pucci remains 2 steps ahead by using the ace up his sleeve of throwing Jotaro's memory disk into Anasui's dying body where it will inevitably be destroyed, forcing Jolene to abandon the fight to save the disk, thus allowing Pucci, like other dodgy priests, to get too close to the child and fuse with it to achieve the next step of the plan. But as the situation looks bleak for Jolene, there is one form of hope. At the cost of more bleakness, as Foo Fighters sacrifices herself to heal Anasui and save the disc. This is such a depressing gut punch moment that in some ways acts as the perfect display of her maturity, both for the sacrifice itself and consoling Jolene through her soul. But I can't help but feel like this moment was cheapened by her having multiple fake-out deaths in the previous few episodes. I'd already gone through the whole mourning process for her when Pucci boiled her, only for when I watched the next episode the day after to see her perfectly fine, and then die. So unfortunately, my reaction was more like, wait, she's dead for real this time? Rather than, no, this can't be happening! Don't get me wrong, I was still really sad to see her go, and I like how the scene plays out. I just think it didn't have the emotional impact on me as I think it should've. So now that Pucci is fused with the baby, the next step of the plan is for him to head to a specific set of coordinates on Earth by the time of the new moon to finally attain heaven. Coordinates that are located at the Kennedy Space Center. Meanwhile, Jolene and the others are still stuck in prison and have to face one last stand user there. Mueller with Jailhouse Lock. A stand that forces its victims to only remember 3 things at a time. I found this fight equally frustrating due to Jolene and Emporio going round in circles as they continually forget the important information, and intriguing since I wondered how they can beat this thing when they can't even remember they're being attacked by a stand. And it turns out Mueller is actually the head guard of the prison. So does anyone mind telling me why the head guard is dressed like a hooker? But thanks to the power binary, they are able to identify and defeat her before then using Jailhouse Lock's ability against the rest of the guards to allow Jolene, Hermes, and Emporio to at last escape Green Dolphin Street to head after Pucci, while leaving the other guys behind to break themselves out. Like, what the hell? Thus bringing an end to the second batch. And now onto the final batch, which is definitely the most eventful of the 3. And I guess the stand users are attracted to other stand users idea is in full swing as we begin with the sudden revelation that Dio has 3 other sons. Riccio, Donatello, and Ungolo, who all just happen to be in Florida and end up at the exact same hospital at the exact same time just as Pucci arrives. How convenient. With Pucci's presence causing them to fully awaken their stand powers for him to send them after Jolene. First up is Ungolo with his stand, Bohemian Rhapsody, which I think has the most absurd stand ability thus far. It has the power to bring fictional characters to life. And yes, it plays out as ridiculously as you would expect from that concept. Seeing all these fictional characters, that they have the rights to, showing up or being name-dropped was such a surreal experience. Like this fucked up version of Pinocchio.
Father, when can I leave to be on my...
It felt like I was in a fever dream. But I was also so enraptured by it out of the curiosity to see how many characters they were gonna fit into all this. With them all being forced to experience the same events from their stories in the real world. And it just gets crazier as it goes on. From how the stand evolves to work on a global scale, bring paintings to life like Van Gogh from his self-portrait, and turn people into other characters to make them experience their events instead. The best way to sum up this fight is pure insanity, and I absolutely love it, including how Weather Report comes up with the most random, yet unironically genius plan to defeat it. He draws his own OC, who has the story of returning all the characters back to their original works, rendering the stand powerless. Though if Ungolo was smart and kept the right works of fiction on his person, then he could have been unbeatable. I summon Godzilla!
Oh, fuck.
And Jolene's side somehow managed to completely avoid all this. Instead, they end up against Riccio, who ends up going down the easiest out of the 3 with his stand Sky High that lets him control these cryptids called Sky Rods for direct attacks and to steal the target's body heat as a means of weakening them. So Jolene's plan to defeat him has her set herself on fire! She really is Jotaro's daughter! Then she just beats him into submission. But following his defeat, Riccio gives them the abrupt reveal that Weather Report is Pucci's brother! Huh? 1, what the fuck? And 2, how did you piece all that together? It wasn't until a few episodes later that they divulged the full background surrounding those two. It's quite a long story, so to give the abridged version, they were separated at birth, which then led to accidental incest between Weather and Pucci's sister Perla during their adolescence. Then Pucci's attempt to split them up didn't go as planned, so Perla committed suicide out of grief, and the despair that Pucci felt upon finding her dead triggered both of their stand awakenings. Then as Weather attempted to seek vengeance for Perla's death against Pucci was when he had his memory disk taken before being locked up for almost 30 years. While this was when Pucci went down the dark path of no return by becoming fully loyal to Dio. This gave me a ton of sympathy towards Weather as he had his life destroyed and ripped away from him due to factors that were completely out of his control, as well as viewing his existence as cursed because of it. While giving me conflicted feelings on Pucci's personality, cause on one hand, the root of his evil stems from such tragic circumstances and grief, but on the other, he's also unnecessarily a dick to Weather due to those out of control factors. It gives me a Dante and Virgil vibe, but with only pure hostility between them in this case, which creates a sad personal touch to the conflict. Back in episode order, Donatello is the only son left with his stand, Underworld. And befitting its name, this stand's ability is terrifying when seeing how it's used. It is able to create physical manifestations of memories of past events, which Donatello uses to trap Jolene and Hermes in the memory of a plane crash, resulting in such an intense and nerve-wracking fight as they must find the means to survive while the clock is literally counting down. But thanks to the creative uses of their stands, they are able to escape safely and back Donatello into a corner. So as a last-ditch effort to escape, he returns Weather Report's memory disk to him, causing him to remember his past and purpose in life of killing Pucci, in addition to regain his stand's full power. Heavy Weather. So that's why he wasn't an All-Star Battle R at launch. I think we have a new holder for the most absurd power title now, cause Heavy Weather creates rainbows that turn people into snails. Was the crack laced with LSD or something? Like, what the fuck is the correlation? So while Jolene's side has to deal with the snails, as they try to rendezvous with Weather, the brothers have their long-awaited rematch to settle the score once and for all. This was such an intense and bloody brawl that kept me on the edge of my seat the whole way through, as it becomes a constant back and forth between who has the advantage. With Pucci finding a loophole through Heavy Weather's effect by removing his sight, but then Weather turns the tables by placing him into an impossible-to-escape position. Now maintaining the advantage, just as Weather is about to deal the finishing blow, the rest of the group crash into the fight, which throws everything into disarray, allowing the tables to turn once again as Pucci takes this opportunity to kill Weather. I was left speechless, as I was in such a state of shock by how sudden this death was. I went through the 5 stages of grief so fast. With all the revelations made about his past and his ties to Pucci, I thought Weather would be a shoo-in for the final battle, but he ended up falling just short of it. Not even with some cool sacrifice or properly going down fighting. Just finished off like he was nothing. Especially from how much I grew to like his character more than what I already did from the rest of the Heavy Weather arc. It makes me even more depressed by this. How is it twice now that the main characters have accidentally botched the chance to kill the villain early? The only thing left now is the final battle, as the remaining characters try to catch up while having Emporio drive the car for some reason, just as Pucci reaches the Space Center. And after arriving at his destination with the green baby's DNA, it causes Whitesnake to evolve into an entirely new stand, Sea Moon, along with gaining an entirely new ability, being to alter gravity. This instantly became such a massive difficulty spike, as everyone is left standing no chance when being challenged by Sea Moon's sheer force. Both from its ability making everything in and around the Space Center fall sideways, thus significantly restricting their maneuverability with almost no room to dodge as they're stuck fighting on the side of buildings, and also from Sea Moon's own physical strength as anything it strikes gets turned inside out in some pretty graphic imagery. This was a clear moment where I think to myself, how can they possibly beat this thing? They lose in a simple head-to-head fight, and any strategy they can come up with to close the power gap easily goes down the drain from hindrances like the altered gravity. Even with Jolene's quick thinking to keep herself going and nullifying the inside-out effect, doesn't help offensively at all. So it just continues to leave Pucci with the upper hand the entire time. Fortunately, this was one instance where there was something that Pucci did not account for. Jotaro's back! Leaving Pucci totally surrounded. So with no other option...
I have to go now. My planet needs me.
Or rather, he uses Sea Moon's gravity to elevate himself to a point where his center of gravity becomes identical to the new moon's. Therefore, he reaches heaven, causing his stand to evolve once again into Made in Heaven. Combine every sense of dread I got from Pucci before with the feelings of hopelessness from the Sea Moon fight, and times that by 100, and you get how I felt watching throughout all of the battle against Made in Heaven, as it continues the trend of JoJo villain stand abilities. By accelerating the flow of time, making all non-living things progressively move faster and faster and faster, and making me feel an insurmountable amount of stress, as I could tell what kind of danger was heading the group's way. Since Pucci's movement speed becomes equal to how fast time is moving, it makes him nigh unhittable and able to just zip in and take out anyone at any given moment. When Jolene set up that web to detect where and when Pucci would come at them, that was the worst of it for me. I found it so nerve-wracking. Just the anticipation of when he'd strike and what would happen when he does was almost too much for me to handle. Again, I could not see any easy way out of this. The only chance they have is with Star Platinum's time stop, and even its time of effect has been sped up. All they can mainly do is flee from the guy who is already going at supersonic speeds. So they have no choice but to put all their eggs in one basket for one last-ditch effort plan to win. Have Diver Down act as a human shield to force Pucci to attack Anasui first, then in that moment, use the time stop to leave him wide open to a beatdown. But even as the plan was being put into motion, I think my heart was beating as fast as time was moving. It was still such a risky plan that might not even work in the end. And the tension rose the closer as Pucci got to them, as it also signified the closer to seeing if this gambit would pay off. And as per usual, Pucci remains 2 steps ahead. With their one chance having failed, Pucci wipes out Anasui, Hermes, and Jotaro, killing all of them. I didn't even realize they were dead at first, cause it was so fast, and I could have sworn JoJo characters have survived worse injuries than those. The emotional shock was ruined for me, and I only have myself to blame for it. Sadly, that isn't the end of it, as with no other means of fleeing, Jolene stays behind to die so that Emporio can escape. And eventually, time accelerates so much that it reaches the end of the universe. Subsequently, shock and depression soon turn to confusion when it returns to Green Dolphin Street. Accelerating time past the end of the universe caused it to loop around into a new universe. It's just like that episode of Futurama, a universe made in Dio's vision of heaven, where everyone from the previous universe has been brought over, save for those who died who are replaced with Chinese rip-off versions. Meaning the only ones left are Emporio and Pucci. With Pucci now making it his priority to kill Emporio as the last loose thread. A bit late to get to this point, but this was when I developed that stronger affinity towards Emporio. At the very end, but better late than never. He just lost all his newfound family, leaving him all alone again, to make me truly feel for his tragic circumstances. And as Jolene said in her tear-jerking last words, he's our only hope left. making me root for him so much. I know the odds are stacked against you to such a massive extent, but you're the only one who can possibly turn this dire situation around. And you know what? He fucking does it! He tricks Pucci into inserting the weather report stand disc into him, activating the stand so it can fill the room with pure oxygen to poison Pucci's body, leaving him immobile and unable to use Made in Heaven, allowing the others to vicariously get the last laugh as their sacrifices were what ultimately aided in this moment coming about. A theme that I love once I thought about it. Everybody was forced to accept the fates of their deaths like what the Heaven Plan sought to achieve. But the irony was that Pucci could not escape his fate to fail right before the plan's completion, as weather reports beats him to death. Then we get an ending that is very tough to wrap your head around. So from my understanding, and I did have to look up some explanations to help come to this conclusion, Pucci's death caused the universe to reset again. This time to one that is identical to the original, with the one exception being that this part's main cast who died have been reborn with new names and happier lives, free from Pucci's influence as he never existed here. I can't really find the exact words to describe my feelings on this ending as I was watching it. The closest I can think of is a conflicting sense of bittersweetness. In a way, the cast did get a happy ending, but it still isn't them. It's much more of a sad ending, as the actual characters I knew and grew to like so much are still dead, effectively being erased from existence too, with their reborn selves teasing us by showing how much better off they could have been had things gone differently, or if they somehow managed to live, reducing me to a somber mood long afterwards. And as Emporio is likely left with tons of PTSD and survivor's guilt, a familiar tune rings out. So that was Stone Ocean, and man, what a trip it was. Before they messed with my emotions so much by the end, what I felt throughout the majority of this part was pure excitement and investment in what was going on, living up to the hype I felt back when the anime was announced, minus Netflix's awful release schedule. The characters were great. The story, while taking a little time to really kick off, was freaking insane with so many twists and turns. It had its own interesting themes on the concept of fate like the last part. Many of the fight scenes were incredibly fun to watch due to how ridiculous the stands were here. And when it comes to the anime specifically, I think a lot of the changes I know they made from the manga were for the better, and the animation was excellent, save for some weird CG here and there. I failed to understand why this was considered the worst part for some time. Yeah, it's different, with its overall darker tone and the ending of having everyone die, but it wasn't a bad sort of different. It had everything I loved about the other parts so far, along with its own original stuff that I thought was great too. If I had to be critical about anything outside the disciplinary wing arc, I'd say I wasn't a big fan of how we never really got a moment where all the main characters were together. At least one of them was absent at all times throughout the parts, and when they broke out, they were split in half. Therefore, there were a couple combinations of characters who never interacted with each other, so I didn't feel as strong of a group dynamic in this part compared to the previous stand-centered ones. Which might have been the point since they were kind of just thrown together by circumstance, but even so, I think it was a missed opportunity. And when I think the interactions were such a big strength of this cast, doing that would have helped to reinforce that aspect. I also felt that the whole plot point of Dio having more kids didn't really go anywhere, since in the grand scheme of things, they weren't any different to your typical enemy stand user. So it ended up feeling like a wasted idea with tons of untapped potential, as I would have liked to have seen more of them, learn more about them, and see how they compare and contrast to Giorno. Which Donatello does a bit with his backstory that I sadly had to leave out to help this video flow better, but I would have liked to have had more of that, and in more depth for all three of them. But those two criticisms weren't anything that had a major effect on my enjoyment of the part, just things I think could have been improved on. And the last thing I wanted to touch on is the other side of the somber feeling I was left with that really sunk in during and after the super nostalgic credits. This is the end of the original universe, both in story and for the audience. Since I know that Steel Ball Run, JoJolion, and I presume the JoJo lands too, all take place in an alternate universe. So while this is not the end of the series as a whole, it is the ending of JoJo as we've come to know it. This is the last time we get to see these versions of these characters. With so many of them from all the parts in this universe I had grown so attached to over the years of falling in love with this absurd series. And I have the utmost faith that the characters from the alternate universe parts will be great in their own ways too when I inevitably get to see them proper, but I still find it sad having to say goodbye to those who came before. Regardless, I am eternally grateful to my past self for biting the bullet and giving the series a shot in the first place, allowing me to experience this bizarre adventure up to this point, and I look forward to seeing what's in store in a different time and a different place.